Greetings, everyone, and welcome back to another installment of the Healing Brothers Presents. It is time to deal with the pain. I'm one of your co-hosts, Brandon Jones, joined by Sam Simmons. And in today's podcast, we have several guests that will be joining us for the 14th annual Community Empowerment through Black Man Healing Conference that takes place this week, September 22nd and 23rd, all online. I'm going to introduce each one of our guests, and we're going to hop in and have a pretty fruitful conversation about their participation in the conference and other things that we're seeing happening in the community. Our first guest is Andre Dukes, Vice President of Family and Community Impact at Northside Achievement Zone. Andre leads the Family Academy, Early Childhood, Parent Leadership, and Community Power initiatives of the Northside Achievement Zone. He oversees the planning, development, management, and implementation of strategies to achieve the greatest possible impact in helping improve outcomes for individuals and families to achieve community level change. Welcome, brother Andre. How you doing?
Well, greetings, everyone.
Perfect. Our next guest is Richard Smith, trauma expert. Richard is a nationally recognized expert on trauma and healing for survivors of interpersonal and systematic violence. He formerly was the national director of Healing Works, a field building and movement building project committed to advancing healing equity for underserved survivors of violence. How are we doing today, sir?
I'm doing grand, just grand. Such a pleasure to be here. Awesome to be able to share space with you, brothers and sister.
Awesome. Thank you. And our next guest is Dr. Portia Cunningham, LMFT, licensed marriage and family therapist. Portia is a proud social justice advocate, compassionate culture and diversity trainer, and thriving business owner. Driven by her passion for others' life stories, most of her work as a mental health provider explores personal growth, meaningful relationship dynamics, and constructive ways to communicate our needs. How are you doing, Dr. Cunningham?
Hello, hello. Happy Sunday. Happy to be here.
Awesome. Happy to have you. And last but not least, the man, the myth, the legend himself, Sam Simmons. What's going on, Sam?
Grouchy as ever. Doing my thing, you know how I am. Shoot, yeah. I'll get better as we go. So, right. And I'm glad to have everybody here today.
Sounds good. Sounds good. Well, go ahead and kick us off, Sam. Let's see where our conversation goes. You know, you've been instrumental these last 14, really 15 years of pulling this conference together, bringing all these beautiful, intelligent geniuses into one central place to talk about helping healing the community over this time span. Where would you like to take today's conversation?
Well, I would like folks to talk about their work and their work and why did they agree to be part of this conference. And so we're going to start with Andre. And so Andre, tell folks a little bit about your work and why you decided to agree to be part of the conference.
Well, thank you, Sam. And again, thanks for having me today on this wonderful panel. So I am the Vice President of Family and Community Impact at the Northside Achievement Zone. We're working to end multi-generational poverty on the North Side, taking a two-generation approach to working with families as well as children in the schools, but also around housing and career and finance. But a big part of our work as well is around wellness. So we also have a community wellness strategy, which is led by Jatan White, which I'm sure, Sam, you've had on the show and others are familiar with. But we are really trying to make sure that we create safe spaces for children where they can grow and thrive. And we believe that working with 35 partners in this work, we are creating, the kinds of supports that children need, not only to survive, but to thrive academically and in life. And so part of that begins with, their wellness. And so we believe that our ecosystem represents protective factors for children that, are dealing with the issues of trauma, dealing with issues of violence. And we really, want to make sure that we are being responsive to the needs of children as a community. And so a lot of our work is around one-on-one supports for the children and for their parents. We have a family academy that is really focused on wellness supports. It's really a series of parent education courses that are age specific to the scholar. And so we focus on parents with children 0 to 3, 4 and 5, kindergarten through 5th grade. And then we just completed and are piloting our final iteration, which is focused on middle school through high school, with the idea that children will be ready for college upon graduating high school. But woven throughout everything that we do is, mental health supports for not just, the children and families, but also for the adults that are teaching and really working with our families on a day-to-day basis. We believe that we all need healing, and we can't be healers if we're not healed ourselves. And so it's just a big part of what we do that runs throughout everything within our ecosystem.
And why did you agree to be part of the conference?
Oh, thank you. So, because I admire Sam Simmons, that's why. But also, I think that we have something to say just around the things that are happening in the community concerning families and how we need to approach families as, really a protective factor for children. When I think about mental health supports, what we know is that every child needs an ecosystem of supports. So it's just not the parent, but it is literally what we always talk about in terms of the village. And so, how does the village work together collaboratively to create a space where children can thrive? And that begins with families, and why we put such a strong emphasis on parents. We believe that parents are the primary teacher. They are best positioned to set the children up for success, both socially and emotionally. And so we put a lot of emphasis on parents because we believe that that is where the power, and that just, represents the family. The family is the power of our community, and we want to continue to send that message. And Sam, you've given me this opportunity, so I had to show up.
Okay, well, thank you, Andre. You know what? I'm gonna skip past Richard and go to Portia. And Portia, tell us a little bit about your work and your work yourself and why you agreed to be part of the conference.
Absolutely. I go by Dr. Portia for my practice. I own a private practice called Rooted Therapy. It's based out of South Florida. It's funny that Andre was talking about families because that's really my niche where I'm focused the most. I would agree a lot with what he's saying, where it does matter the healing, one, in the parent, but also how that trickles down to that next generation and what that looks like for like transgenerational healing in that space. Also, I'm a professor, so I teach at a few local universities. Primarily, my focus is supervision. And what I do is I'm looking to help equip and make the next generation of mental health providers more aware and more sensitive to cultural dynamics, as well as those interpersonal family dynamics that even can cultivate safety or create a space for healing to actually take place. And then also to speak a little bit to why I agreed to be in this conference, I believe that healing starts in a safe space. And what I have found with this organization thus far is that there's a lot of safety being created in order for healing to occur. a safe space to say, hey, I've been through trauma, hey, I've been through something, and this is impacting me. But also a safe space for change where we can reach the more family oriented goals that we have in order to become closer and more supportive, to become that village. So I'm excited to be a participant, and I'm excited to contribute in whatever way I can.
Thank you. Richard, tell us a little bit about your work and why you agree.
Yeah, you know, this is what is this, Sam? This is my third year participating in some capacity. Um, the thing that I always say in my description of the conference, it is the most, I think it's the most blackest, the most um, healing conference space that I've ever had a chance to participate in. And, unfortunately now we're kind of relegated to the virtual, but the in-person conference experience was exactly what Portia described, right? It was a space of safety that was created by you, Sam, by the committee, to allow folks to come and share about their experiences of trauma and the ways that their experiences of trauma not only impact themselves, but impacts their relationships with their partners, with their family members, and the community as a whole. My work has just been that, right? Helping people to understand the impact of trauma on their lives. Really thinking about it, not just like from a interpersonal experience, but also historical experience and like the transgenerational or the intergenerational transmission of trauma, and how that kind of lives in our bodies as well as the interpersonal experiences of trauma. One of the things that I recently started was a social enterprise called Alignment Global with my business partner Jorge Vidal. That really is a social enterprise that's focused on cultural reclamation, healing centered practices, and ways to engage community and determining what healing looks like for them as a result of their experience of various forms of trauma. And so one of the things that I've recently, over the last like 4 years, realized, similar to what Brother Andre was saying, is that there were a lot of people who were really intentional about doing the work, the healers, so to speak. Many of them come through this peer support model process where there's like the credible messengers or violence intervention people, folks who've been there, done that, who've experienced similar exposure to trauma like incarceration or gun violence, who are being enlisted to do this work to support young people in the community who were experiencing similar hardships that they had been exposed to. And what I realized is that they were doing a phenomenal job of supporting the young people in some ways, but when it came to addressing their own experiences of trauma and continuing their healing journey, unfortunately, they weren't getting the support that they needed. And so that put me on this journey to like develop a process for healing the healers and creating space for them to be able to put themselves first, which is oftentimes very difficult for folks who experience trauma and found meaning in their experience in a way that can help them help others. They oftentimes forgot about themselves, and this was an opportunity for us to really center them in a way that they can continue to look at how trauma was not only just something that they've experienced in the past, but how it continued to show up in their bodies and their relationships today.
Okay. And did you answer why you agreed to do this? Maybe. I guess when you said you've been here 3 times, I guess that was your answer.
No, I mean, more specifically, it's a lot of love for you, Sam. I consider you an elder, a mentor, a confidant, a grumpy uh, person that I love and I care a lot about. But I also know that you are one of the few people, and I've been fortunate to work with a lot of people throughout the country that are really centering trauma in a way that points us in the direction of ourselves and emphasizes the importance of us truly understanding how it impacts us as individuals, as Black folks, as families, as Black folks, and as community as Black folks. And so, anytime that I have an opportunity to support the work that you're doing, I'm always going to show up.
Okay, so let's open this up a little bit. You got any questions, Brandon, or you want me to continue on?
I have a question. Um, I'm curious to know, and there's no right or wrong answer for this, but how do you each define healing? I know this is the focus of the conference. You all kind of spoke about your own journeys in this healing effort, but what's your definition of healing? And anyone can start, whoever wants to dive on
I'll start because I want to brag about something.
in. Go for it.
Uh, so one of the things that we've been able to do, I've been fortunate to work with a couple of researchers out of Silverman School of Social Work in New York to develop a scale to measuring healing outcomes for young people of color who've been impacted by community violence. And that scale has been piloted, and it is now on its second iteration of testing. It was a scale that was developed by Black and Brown people. The participants, the focus groups, the interviews all were Black and Brown people. It was essentially a scale that was created for us by us, and we call it the Community Scale for Healing Possibility. And before we could even develop that scale, one of the things that we needed to do was to have a operationalized definition of healing. And so, from the interviews that we had with young people of color and service providers, and the focus groups that we had with similar participants, we came up with this definition of healing that is getting to the core and reclaiming possibility. Because we feel like what we realize is that the process of getting to the core and realizing that something has happened to you is very critical in order to relieve the shame, to start that process of recognizing that there's opportunity and possibility for you to for you to heal, for you to address the harm that you experience, and then reclaiming possibility. We realize that that trauma has stolen people's belief and hope and possibility that they could do the things that they once engaged in, like having relationships with people without feeling frightened or feeling alerted or just holding their child. And so for us, that definition, which I will offer, is getting to the core and reclaiming possibility as a definition for healing that I often use.
If I can piggyback on that, I love that, Brother Richard. And we talk a lot about core value and just the ability to always connect to our core value. When we have negative experiences in life, certainly that diminishes the value in our minds. And so it takes some activity, some environment, some interactions to compensate for those negative interactions that allow us to reconnect to our core value. And a lot of that work happens in the way that we process our environment and being able to, pick out and recognize the strong points, the strength, the bright sides of our experiences, which a lot of people are unable to do. And then the stressful moments begin to exacerbate and become trauma. And then we have acute trauma and compounded trauma. And, we get deeper and deeper into this hole and are unable to reconnect with our core. But the more that we can be in control of our thoughts and the way we process things, it's easier for us to stay connected to our core value. I always talk about a baby being born and all of the love and attention that baby gets. But then as they grow up and begin to socialize and experience life, a lot of that security that they feel early in the early years begins to become diminished. And so we forget that we're still that precious baby that is worthy of attention, worthy of praise, and love, and all of the things that make us whole and human beings. So just being able to connect and stay connected to that core value is so important to our healing.
Absolutely. And just to piggyback off of a piggyback, um, I hear exactly what Richard is talking about, where he starts to talk about trauma and how it impacts the dynamic of a relationship. And then also with Andre, I hear him saying how even the trauma, although it may come through adversity in life, we essentially started out, or hopefully we're starting out with much more support than we have, like as we transition and continue this life journey. But I like to say in my practice all the time that for me, healing is just as contagious as trauma. So trauma can be contagious, right? Because hurt people will act in hurtful ways that end up hurting those around us at times, most of the time unintentionally. But for me, when I define healing, it is a state of being to where you no longer are okay with not being okay. Um, and also, you start to bring awareness to your body, because I think trauma has an impact on the systems around us for sure. But first and foremost, it has an impact on us, on our health. You see this with high blood pressure. You see this in statistics in the Black community with heart diseases, or issues with blood, or other manifestations of stress in the body over long extended periods of time. And I think that that also wears and tears on our ability to heal from past trauma as well, because we have to have a certain level of energy and health about us to even confront these relationships in effective ways. So for me, healing would be a space where you can sit in your body and that feel good, right? Where we don't have to cope with other mechanisms, where we're not responding, where we're responding rather than reacting, excuse me. Those spaces let me know that I'm in a space of healing, right? That I'm here to be just as contagious in that way, and to spread healing both within myself first, my regulatory systems first, but also then to leak over into those around me.
Got it. Thank you all for your answers. Appreciate it. Go ahead, Sam.
So the conference is this year. One of the things for folks who've been involved with the conference, or find out once they come to this particular conference, is this is not a conference just to be having conferences and so everybody can get together and hang out and that. I mean, we do a little bit of that, but we always do ours after it's all over, because it's so important for folks to be there and that kind of thing. And so a lot of time I will base it around a provocative question. And the question this year was, how does a community supposed to heal when it feels like it's under attack? And then we qualified with both internally and externally. What is your thoughts about that question? Let me see. I'm just going to.
A super complex question was my first thought. Like, there's so many facets to that, right? I love it, and it is provocative, but at the same time, there are external factors that impact us. There are definitely those internal pieces that we have to work on. And the idea, I'd like that you use the verb attack, because it really does feel like that when you're in trauma or when you're under systemic oppression. It's coming from all sorts of directions. So to answer the question, what do I think about the question? It's extremely complex, but much needed. I'm probably going to let one of the guys answer it first, but I love the question, by
the way. Well, your response is the response I get from folks. So what's the conference about this year? Well, this is what we're going to, and they'll get quiet and they'll smile and says, that makes sense. Then they walk off, but but that's a whole nother conversation. So what about what do you, gentlemen, what do you think? What do you think? Who's the brave one to go first?
Well, I don't mind being brave, and certainly, I've been caught many times not being correct in my answers, but that's okay too. But I think what I think about when I think about, a community being under attack, I think about war and the ways in which people endure war. And they try to, find places of safety and shelter. And so it becomes an environmental issue. And I think, how we approach, the attacks may not feel as direct as being under warfare. It depends on where you live, though, because argue that some people may feel like every day they're living literally in a war zone. But this is where, I got to speak as a person of faith and just believe that, there is something beyond what I can see. If I can't get to a place where I have hope, then it's going to be very hard for me to heal. And I think that that is a huge issue, especially in our community today, is that there's so much hopelessness. And where are people looking to find faith and hope that, their environments can change in the way that they can do something to affect that change? A lot of people just say, well, this is just the way that it is. The young people call this the trap. And the trap is, there's a trap house and all of that, but it's just expecting that your end result in life is going to be negative, and you get caught in that cycle. And so a lot of young people are, resisting the trap and thinking about ways, but innate in that is this ideal of faith and belief that there is something beyond what I'm experiencing today. And again, I don't think I have all of the the answers in how to address that, but I think those are some of the elements that we have to discuss as we address this question.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Um, it's a call to action. So, the question captures the reality of our experience as Black folks in this country, right? We know, and on the planet, period, that there's these experiences of interpersonal trauma that we are having a lot of times with our own families, people the closest to us. Then there's these systems that, in my opinion, have created the conditions that produce the behaviors that lead to families hurting each other. Um, and then there are also these systems that are continuing to cause harm blatantly to us in various forms, whether it's mass incarceration, whether it's police brutality. Um, and so for me, it's a call to action that we shouldn't just, you know, think about trauma as isolated incidents that happen to other people, but that they are experiences that are almost ubiquitous in Black communities and they are constant in Black communities. And therefore, I see the conference topic as a call to action on what are we going to do about that? What are the ways that we should come together to address all of the areas? What type of defense are we going to put into place to kind of protect us from these attacks? What is the work that's going to be done to support individuals with healing on their journeys? And so it's a call to action to me, and that's how I see it.
Um, Brandon, what you got any thoughts on that?
I think all of our guests gave great perspectives on this complex problem that we have, and I think that we're at a peak time where when we look at healing, we can't say that it's one way or another. It's both external and internal, the forces that we're facing. And I think the internal battle for us is the hardest because when you have been victimized by systems, it's hard to point your finger at yourself or at the people who look like you and say, "Well, you're part of this, problem as well." And I think that's one of our biggest struggles. But internally, we have to build institutions as well. The institution of family was brought up. I think about education as a huge part of the institution. Oftentimes, we hear about economics being a part of the institution, but we have all these different things that we have to work on, and it's hard to figure out which one to take first because the trauma is so thick. But I think that the most important thing that we can do is figure out what is our end goal and what are we going to focus on when we talk about healing, when we talk about battling systems, etc. And one of the things that I've kind of concluded on is if we can focus on children and make their outcomes the best thing, maybe that's something that we can all galvanize around, no matter what our religious faiths are, what our positions are politically. If we could just say we want Black children to have better outcomes, and we're willing to do any and everything possible to make sure that that happens, that may be something that we can put our healing efforts towards.
Okay. Um, let me see.
Can I add to that for a second, Sam?
Okay.
Would that be okay?
Yeah.
Really
For it.
But one of the things that I wanted to say is that when it comes to healing, I can't the external piece. I'm gonna leave that out and let everyone else talk about that. But for the internal piece, I really think that it's important though that we, even as parents, right, we want to make this change with children, but we have to recognize self. We have to pick up and find, not even find, because it wasn't lost. We have to reclaim our value and our yeah, our value just as people, right? Like how we feel. Oftentimes I see so many Black families come into my office and there's so much pain, but it's almost like a resistance to acknowledging that emotion. It's existent, it's a less than, sometimes we feel like, as defense mechanisms to cope. And I think that's some of the inner work that we can do if we create that safe space where we can open up and it's safe to be vulnerable, to actually make that type of change or to create that type of safety with our youth.
Absolutely. The word that might have been escaping you is humanity. I think a lot of us, as we get beaten down so often, we lose a little bit of piece of ourselves and that value and dignity. And it's easy for us to pour into other people instead of pouring back into ourselves due to that. But that's what ends up happening, and that's what trauma does. Trauma makes things about the moment, and it makes it let the self-interest piece gets very interesting when people are significantly traumatized as well. So I agree with your stance.
Well, so I'm gonna kind of discuss what I was thinking about when I came up with the question. Okay. And Brandon asked the question about healing, or what do you say trauma is, and that kind of stuff. And I was thinking about that. My view around the issue of healing, especially, so I'm very clear. I'm not all over the place. I'm very clear. I am absolutely focused on Black folks. No ifs and buts about it. And then I take it to another extent, Black folks who have American slavery in their background, because those folks are uniquely different from, not that Black folks haven't suffered around the world, but they are uniquely different experience that nobody should have ever had to experience. Now, we can say, well, there was slavery other places, but America is one of the countries that doubled and tripled down on the whole piece in terms of stripping people of their humanity. When you get to a point where you feel like it's okay to breed people, you done went to the lower levels of stripping somebody of their humanity. So I believe the issue around healing is difficult because we don't want to tell the whole truth. And the whole truth is quite painful. Okay? I believe, right? And the whole truth includes our part of the trauma. And it's more comfortable talking about the other parts because we've been historically been exposed to that, right? Right now, and again, I'm out there right now. I believe right now, if the system changed tomorrow, we're going to have some major problems unless we get a real honest conversation about how that trauma has affected what we view as community and what we view as culture, right? As one young woman said when we had our last podcast, and I was talking about, we got to learn how to adapt to trauma differently. She says, Mr. Simmons, no, the problem is we adapted too well to trauma. And now we done got to a point where we can't go no further with this trauma thing. Because I get tired of us start talking about, we'll say, yeah, we need to deal with our stuff internally, and then we quickly go back to external, right? Because we don't want to sit in that uncomfortable. We often talk about our white counterparts being uncomfortable. We are just as equally uncomfortable to have an honest conversation as much as they are about how that stripping of our humanity for so long has gotten to a point where we have to regain that. And you can't regain that when you deny your trauma. And see, if you deny your trauma, you deny your humanity, because if you hurt people, hurt human beings, they are hurt and they are traumatized. You cannot, and it shows up in our relationships, we try to make it sound like in the community, we were all kumbaya back in the day, and we had this going on. Man, I'm 68 years old. I've been traumatized by my community for about 35 of those years. Now, that might not be how anybody else want to describe it. You know, I hear Andre talking about this baby who comes in the world, then somewhere along the line, you know, they run into trauma. What do you do when babies are born in trauma? As Black people, when they brought us to the shores of America, we started our culture in America surviving trauma. And nobody, I don't believe any human beings is supposed to be resilient for no 400 years without trying to evolve above surviving trauma. So the question for me came up because we're going in circles right now asking, getting people on the news that look like us talking about we need to come together and we need to stop this. And you who know who's doing need to turn yourself in. It's like, please. The thing is I believe we have the power to turn a lot of this stuff around, but we cannot do it until we want to be truthful within ourselves. Because I know, at least in the work I've done around trauma and the perpetrator, if we want to call the system the perpetrator, once you change, the perpetrator ain't got no other choice but to change. And so, some people might call that harsh or whatever, but a lot of the techniques we used in the past to survive our trauma, we're still trying to use them and they don't apply. And unless we get to a point that we can evolve above the ways we have adapted to the trauma to get from day to day, and do more than just surviving, because the older generation, when I first started doing this work, the old generation would shut me down and say, why are you talking about trauma? We're resilient people. Why are you being negative? Right? And the babies would say, you ask the babies, what is resilient? They said, man, one dude said, man, we like roaches. We ain't going nowhere. And he wasn't a comedian. He wasn't telling a joke. He meant that. And then we want to act. So when you continue, we always know we talk about Black folks are the canary in the mine. Whatever you do bad to Black folks is going to happen to white folks. Well, we also have the canary in the mine in our own community when we don't listen to the babies, no matter how out there they sound. And they will tell you in their own little way what the deal is, what's really going on when they start talking about Mr. Simmons. How am I supposed to respect elders that when they say one thing and then I see them doing something else in the community? How do I respect organizations when they can't even collaborate amongst themselves and then they want and act like a gang no more than we do? And so the thing is again, there is power within us if we start with the uncomfortable truth around how we have conditioned ourselves, like when we do the work. Providers in our community, we don't go to school to be doctors and lawyers and therapists and that kind of stuff because it's a profession. We go with the hope to come back to help our people. That puts an extra burden on us to the point where we don't even think it's okay to take care of ourselves because our community won't let us take care of ourselves. So that's why I came up with the question, because I've been trying to say all this. And then folks keep coming back to, well, the system ain't changing. The system is bad. System mistreat everybody. Now, do they treat us even worse? It does feel like that. But the system ain't good for even them. Okay? But I do know what we doing internally to each other around our trauma by not recognizing how that trauma, and naturally so, has harmed our ability to even relate to each other in that visionary mind that we think about. We have to also deal with reality. Like we keep talking about family. People keep talking about two parents. Right now, the reality is a lot of our families are not two parents. So how do we support the fact that every child should have at least one healthy parent in their life better than none. We have to deal. We don't have the option to not deal with reality like other people do. In reality, you can't deal with the reality and keep talking about what you hope for. You can't talk about what you hope for until you do it now. And then hope for is what you're going to do in the front side. So that's just me. We got a few minutes left. You can respond one way or the other, but that's why the question came up on my end.
Oh, love you, Sam. Love you. Love your grumpy butt. Listen. Listen. No, seriously, all jokes aside, and that's the part that I really appreciate, right? And I think it's something that's actually kind of missed, without having many of our elders in a space where they can give us that hard truth, the way that you always give us. And I love what you said about the humanity. We can't address our humanity without addressing our trauma, and I think that's the piece um, that is missing. One, I'll say this: I think people really do not understand trauma. I think people are just using that term consistently, and they don't really understand it. And I say that because we'll think about it as it relates to developing programs that are trauma informed, as it relates to working with other people. But when it comes to recognizing how trauma impacts your mother and how that affects you, when it comes to recognizing how trauma impacts your partner and how that affects you, even those of us who say we know so much about trauma, right, are oftentimes like we forget all of that information, right? And we don't want to even sometimes use some of those tools and skills and ways to support their healing. And we result to the same practices that systems do, which, in my opinion, they punish people for their unaddressed trauma responses instead of recognizing that something happened to them. But I also think that like that piece about the humanity is so critical because it's like when you realize that you're human and that you're fallible, that things happen to you, right? It releases the shame that I think allows you to open up and talk about some of those things that you've done, that you're ashamed about, that hurt other people, but that are rooted in some other experiences of trauma that you may not even be attuned to. One of the things people are talking about now is this shadow work. And in my mind, the way that I see it is the unconscious. We know that there's a consciousness that people have about the things that they've experienced, but there's this big unconscious that is the bulk of the iceberg, that is beneath the surface, that has a greater impact and pull and push on our behaviors and the way that we relate to each other, that oftentimes doesn't show up until we encounter situations that makes us feel insecure, that triggers us in a way that our bodies just take over. And we find ourselves saying things like, how do I do this when I know all of this stuff? But yet it's still, I'm conscious of all of these things. I can define healing, I can define trauma, but my body is still reacting in a way that I feel like I have no control. And so for me, I think, that piece about recognizing our humanity to reduce the shame so that people can have these kind of conversations about the hurt that they've experienced and the hurt that they cause other. And I think it is really thinking about how trauma impacts the people that you work with, that you are connected to, and your family. And how do we incorporate that type of trauma lens in there? While, and I'm sure Portia could talk about that, like by also uh, setting boundaries and keeping ourselves safe. Because I'm not saying that we should try to support and help family members at the expense of our own harm. So I'll stop there.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I would like to touch on that. I hear what you're saying, Sam, and honestly, this whole time, all I could think was like, yes, like this inner child in me, but also this Black woman, this Black mother to a Black son, and a Black daughter. I feel this pull in my heart because I hear what you're saying, and I see it from a different lens now. Like, yes, I have my professional piece, but there's a personal piece to me as well, where I can take those skills and cross them over. So do I want my skills to help my community? Absolutely. But the first community that I address is my own, the one I created. And I love that you brought in the external, internal, and that's why I didn't shoot at that question first, because when we look at the lineage that has been in the Black home, and like you said, take it all the way back to slavery, what ended up happening is that those the individuals in power at that time, they treated us less than. They spoke to us with criticism. They used physical aggression to control, right, and to keep suppressed. But over time, you see generations of a Black family, both the father, both the mother, both the children, aunts, uncles, all of that, one being separated, and two still seeing others that look like them be treated in these ways. And I think over time, we've cultivated this idea of culture, right? Like, oh, this is just how it is. Like, this is a part of us. Unknowingly, we might have taken on some of those cultural pieces that are really just toxic and created coping mechanisms around them, because it matters how we speak to each other. We need to reclaim our humanity, right? We need to say, actually, like you said, I am hurt, right? I want to be spoken to with love. I want that same support that Andre was talking about earlier with the family when the children are younger. Like, we deserve those just on a human level. So I think reclamation of that will empower us in a whole different way.
Thank you. Anybody else?
The only thing I would add is that, you know, listening to you, Sam, makes me think about, how people perceive healing. And, knowing that, the history of this nation is really rooted deeply in trauma, you have to ask yourself the question, do we really know what healing is? Have we ever experienced it on a mass level? And you have to, start to ask the question, if that is even possible, the way our country is, certainly organized right now. And I think what has happened is that a lot of people define healing for themselves, but then that defining healing for self can also be looked at as a coping mechanism as well. And so I just always continue to ask myself, have I ever experienced real healing? Have I done enough of the internal work to realize the true value of self? And, if I'm totally honest with myself, even today, with all of the success that I've had, I still doubt myself. I still question, some of my thoughts and my actions and those kinds of things. And it causes me to ask me, well, really, am I truly healed? Am I healed to the level where I can just appreciate who I am as a person and not have to really look to others to validate me, or look to the things that I have in my life to validate me? And I think, if we are honest with ourselves as a community, many of us still have not done that kind of work, right? To get to that level of internal healing where we recognize that outside of any perception that people might have, anything that has been done to me in my life, I have value, I have worth, and I have something to contribute to humanity, right? I am humanity, right? In and of myself. And so, you just have to continue to ask, are we really healed as a do we know what that means? Have we ever experienced healing, or have we experienced levels of coping that we've accepted and now defined as healing?
Ooh, I done opened up a great can of worms. Oh my goodness. I like this. And because the reason I like this is that I found that when you give folks a different conceit, my whole thing is I believe as a community we can heal. Again, but we cannot heal without being fully honest with the how this trauma, this historical trauma, the current trauma, and especially the trauma after the last 40 years has had on us. And I do talk about that. I do say the last 40 years, because the last 40 years, as resilient as I think we have been as a whole, the last 40 years was the last major blow to our community, because it had the biggest blow on family and community, and particularly Black women. And I know that there's this piece out in the world or out online where certain groups of Black men want to be upset because Black women are doing their thing, and they feel offended by that for some goofy reason. But that I got a belief about that, but that's not what we're about today. So I'm gonna leave that alone. But I love this because that's the piece. Now, what you're talking about, Andre, my view of healing is a continuous process. I'm still broken. My brokenness don't guide my life anymore, right? Because that brokenness don't necessarily go away, and it always at vulnerable times will creep up. And asking yourself that question is part of the healing and part of the honesty and vulnerability at least you have with yourself, right? Because when I decided to quit being perfect, oh man, I've been happy ever since 35 years old, and grouchy. I don't have a bunch of friends because I don't need a bunch of friends because those of my friends were freeloaders anyway, because I was a good old darky. But I'm good. I'm very good, but I think Brandon had something he wanted to say because he lit up his microphone, but we're gonna let him do that.
I didn't light it up. I was just gonna get ready to wind it on down and hand it back over to you. But I think it's only right that since I asked the question, I answer it as well. My definition for healing is kind of encompasses a lot of what was already stated, but it's a consistent process of efforts to create peace, balance, and justice. And when I think about the clinical work that I've done, the community work that I've done, the individual work that I've done with myself, those are like three of the core things that I see our folks striving for is peace, balance, and justice at the end of the day. And I think that one of the traps we find ourselves in is thinking that our healing process is to meet or match a destination, not understanding that it's a journey that we're going to be continuously going through. Because as we develop, as we get older, as our community continues to move forward, stuff changes. The trauma might not change. It may look different, but our lives do change and how we're impacted by our lives do change. So I think that we're always striving and finding different ways to cope as we move forward. So just wanted to share that before we wrapped up.
Yeah, we got about 7 minutes, I think. But the thing you bring up, the other thing is you talk about that peace and justice and the all like that, is we also got to understand that expecting who we believe, and I do mean who we believe is a perpetrator, to be responsible for that healing is a waste of time.
Bingo.
Okay. We done focus so much energy on them, right? We don't even realize that we're imitating them, even in the way we're approaching trauma. And we need to really put our heads around our uniqueness. I mean, and sometimes we don't put our heads around our uniqueness in terms of how we how we have dealt with this abuse, and still in some ways as a young people we're still here, but now we got to improve how we are still here, right? And give ourselves that credit. And so I think part of the reason we don't like talking about the conversation about trauma, we done been so conditioned to believe that our consequence is our fault that we don't even want to have a conversation about the trauma because we think it's our fault. That I don't necessarily believe that all of the trauma is our fault, but I do believe it's our responsibility. The healing is ours. And we don't want to, and I don't think we should give that away to nobody, right? And that's where I see the power and hope at. But we can't do it unless we can truly be honest and down in the nitty gritty that, after the crack era, we are the individuals of that age who are about 50 years old or a little younger, or the new grandparents. Those kids grew up in trauma. That was some of the most devastating trauma effects on our community as a whole, in terms of those fragments we had left of what we call the Black community. And you got to understand, those kids raised kids in trauma and actually incorporated trauma in the way they raised their kids. And the next set did. And now the set we got out here who entertain themselves at the cost of everybody else because they don't feel like they have nothing to lose, because they're not looking at the way they live. They're more concerned on what kind of chaos they can do when they die, because at least they won't get forgotten about. And nobody wants to have that honest conversation, both internal and external. And they're external, all they want to do is punish. And internal, all we want to do a lot of times is make excuses, and both of them are bad. So we got a couple minutes for everybody to give their last words and, kumbaya about the conference and all these other kind of good stuff. And Brandon, should I just leave them all on the page, since you the director and all?
It's all good. We can leave everybody on, and everybody can share the last words. It works perfect.
So, who wants to go? Let me see. Y'all ain't gonna answer no way. Andre, you can go first. Let's start back with you first. Go ahead. Okay. Your last words.
Thank you again for allowing me to be a part of this discussion. The only thing that I will end with is that last year I had the opportunity to go to Africa for the first time, to the nation of Senegal. And I was just amazed at the attitudes that folks had in a country that is 50% impoverished, minimal jobs, all of the natural resources controlled by the French still, all of the infrastructure being controlled by the Chinese, but yet these people work together. There's such a sense of community. There's no degree of separation between faith, family, and community. Everyone is an entrepreneur. Everyone is looking out for each other. They have very little homelessness because everybody's door is open to each other. They are the most hospitable, the most compassionate people that I've ever been in. And when I talk about environment, regardless of what has happened to them, they have been able to incubate themselves around humanity. And I think that that is such an example for what is possible for us, even in this nation, if we can have the right attitude and really see each other as valuable to our collective existence. So I'll leave with that.
Richard, we'll go to you next, and we'll let Dr. Portia take us up out of here. How about
that? Yeah, I think last words, I just want everyone to come to the conference, participate in the conference, be a part of these conversations. This is not the last year of the conference, so if you can't make it, tell a friend to register, and then we'll be back. But on another, like, more personal note, the way that I really understood trauma and the impact of trauma was reflecting on myself, right, and my personal behaviors, right. And equally, the way that I understood healing as a journey, as Brother Andre said, was also through myself, right? And realizing that there are going to be some things that might still show up along that journey that are results of the trauma. But because I've gotten this far healing, I know that healing is possible. And so trauma is definitely real. It's ubiquitous, but healing is also possible. And I think the most important step that we could take in this direction of community healing, family healing, is to start that healing journey on a personal level with ourselves.
And then I guess I'll close out like you said, Sam. When I really appreciate having the opportunity to be in this conversation and just contributing to the dialogue. You started us off with a very complex question. But I think it's a much needed one. And I think it shines light on areas that opens opportunity for change. So I appreciate that. I'm looking forward to contributing to that. I think that healing is not a destination, but like you said, Sam, it's a journey, right? Like, will I continue to stay broken? Possibly. But does that mean that it's going to have to lead my life in the same way? Absolutely not. And so I know that there are other layers to this, right? To the complexity of making change in that area. But I'm excited to be a part of it. And I'm excited to, I was already excited for this podcast, but I'm extra excited about the conference.
Okay. So, Brandon.
All right. I think that'll do it for us today. Thank you all for joining us for today's podcast. Be sure to subscribe and to share it. And also be sure to register for the conference this upcoming Thursday, September 22nd and September 23rd. Thank you all. We are out. See you next time. Peace.